Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Tim Russell, Vice President, Community Engagement and Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion for WTTW and WFMT. And welcome to today's Chicago Tonight Black Voices, a WTTW News Community Conversation. WTTW is committed to producing and presenting trusted best-in-class content fueled by distinctly Chicago sensibility. We have served as Chicago's window to the world, and our purpose is to enrich lives, engage communities, and inspire exploration. Essential to this purpose are our core values, in particular, diversity and equity. We celebrate differences, embrace inclusivity, and strive for equity. The stories we tell, as well as the people in front of and behind the camera and microphone, reflect the myriad of faces and voices of our region. Lead support for Chicago Tonight Black Voices is provided by Fifth Third Bank. Additional support is provided by Gertrude Dane and James H. Wooten Jr., Allstate, the Chicago Community Trust, Eon Clinics, the Joseph and Bessie Feinberg Foundation, the Field Foundation of Illinois, Lloyd A. Fry Foundation, Julian Grace Foundation, Nicholas Anton, and Judy and John McCarter. Finally, members and viewers like you make it possible for WTTW to bring provocative ideas to life, to tackle the issues that matter, and to expand our perspectives on the world in which we live. There's only one reason why this is possible, and the reason is you. Thank you for your support. And please now welcome our host, Brandis Friedman.
Hi, Tim, and thank you for that introduction. And hello, and welcome to our audience. And welcome to Chicago Tonight Black Voices, a WTTW News community conversation. And thank you for spending your Monday night with us. As Tim said, I am Brandis Friedman. As you know, the 19th Amendment granted women the right to vote over 100 years ago, but many were still left disenfranchised until the Voting Rights Act of 1965. This includes Black, Asian, and Latina women and Indigenous people. More than a century later, voting rights is still a key issue. National legislation to expand rights has stalled in Congress, while over a dozen states have passed laws to restrict voting rights. And this all comes ahead of the 2022 midterm election. So tonight we will look back on the suffrage and the civil rights movements, and we will talk about where voting rights stand today. Now, you are all in a listen-only mode, so that means you can't speak, but we still want to hear from you, and we want you to be a part of this conversation. So please use that Q&A function to chime in with your questions and comments. I will be going through them, as will my producer, and we will make sure that our guests get to hear those questions. Speaking of our guests, let's start by introducing some of them and thanking them for taking time out of their busy schedules to spend with us. First, Mary Morton is president of Morten Group. She's also a longtime activist in Chicago who's worked to advance the rights of women, people of color, and LGBTQ people. She's also a past director of the Office of Violence Prevention for the Chicago Department of Public Health. Mary, thank you for joining us. Also welcome Felicia Davis Blakely, president and CEO of the Chicago Foundation of Women. She spent much of her career in the public sector as a police officer and then director of the Office of Public Engagement in Mayor Rahm Emanuel's office. Welcome back, Felicia. And Katrina Phidd, communications and digital strategy manager at Chicago Votes. She's also been organizing around educational inequity and mass incarceration for several years. Thanks to all three of you for joining us. So before we get to the discussion, I want to start off with a clip from Chicago Stories, one particular episode that WTTW produced on Ida B. Wells. Here it is.
Ida B. Wells, now 50 years removed from slavery, still did not have the power to vote. But she had joined Illinois women in a partial victory.
In June of 1913, women in Illinois can vote in the presidential election, and they can vote in local municipal elections, but they cannot vote, for example, for governor or for senator.
Encouraged, Ida B. Wells took up the suffrage cause with new fervor. Noting that white suffragists were working like beavers, she established the Alpha Suffrage Club. Their slogan, race interest first, last, and all the time. The club mobilized Black women in the Black Belt Second Ward and eventually helped elect Chicago's first Black alderman.
So ordinary women, not the highfalutin Black women of Chicago. Ordinary women were told they had worth and could make a change in society.
That spring, Ida B. Wells set her sights on Washington, D.C. On the day before Woodrow Wilson's inauguration, she boarded a train bound for the National Suffrage Parade.
Wells travels with the Illinois delegation. She gets to Washington, D.C. There are state delegations from all over the United States, and Illinois is very large. They've got drum majors.
Wells and 250,000 women approached Pennsylvania Avenue. But Alice Paul, the lead parade planner, had a last-minute concern. Southern white women wouldn't march if they had to do so alongside Black women. Planners suddenly asked that the Black delegates march separately, in the back. Ida B. Wells Barnett was struck by the news.
So Wells says, of course, I'm not going to do that. I came here with my delegation from Illinois. I intend to march with my delegation. And they march anyway, all together. And so the march is integrated. And it's just classic Wells. I mean, she stands for her principles no matter what.
So makes you want to go and watch the entire episode of Chicago Stories, that one in particular on Ida B. Wells, if you have not already. But of course, we know today that there are plenty of Black women still continuing to play a key role in the electorate, many leading efforts today. Mary Morton, I want to start with you, please. What women stand out to you among those who are doing the work for voting rights? Uh-oh.
Always, at least once a day. I have to be on mute.
Well, and there's your one.
That's my one, exactly, this evening. I think the women that stand out are certainly the women in the South that have really led the way on this work. In general, Black women have been really instrumental in Texas, in Florida, and in Georgia. And those are some of the states that I'm familiar with. And I think, of course, of Stacey Abrams. And I think of other groups of women, like the National Black Women's Roundtable, who are leading efforts in other states as well, to really mobilize women across the country. And Black women have done that work in many of the elections, particularly most recently.
Felicia, same question to you, and then Katrina, I'll come to you as well.
Yeah, I have to note, Stacey Abrams was the speaker at the Chicago Foundation for Women's annual luncheon last year. But even Stacey says and acknowledges that she's quick to point out that she did not do this work alone. And so there were a number of Black women who worked alongside her: Insay Uffold, Helen Butler, Deborah Scott, and Tamika Atkins. They were all involved in the Democratic voter registration and motivation efforts in the state. And even today, you know, a number of trans activists are pushing for inclusion and making sure that trans women are also, with the name changes and some of the other things that have been creating barriers to access to the ballot. And so there are a number of women that are working on that effort today.
Yeah, and I think we'll get to the efforts around trans women as well in a bit. Katrina, same question to you. Who stands out?
Yeah, I think right away, the first person that comes to mind is, again, Stacey Abrams in Georgia, setting a great example. I think here in Illinois, we also have a number of organizations with dedicated advocates who maybe their name's not always in the spotlight, but we work at Chicago Votes. We have a good relationship with, like, Rainbow Push, for example. And there's a woman there named Miss Betty who has been a voting rights activist fighting for this for decades. Also in Illinois, Avalon Betts Gaston, a formerly incarcerated woman who is really active in championing the fight to restore voting rights to women in prison as well.
So, you know, we've heard of course, poll taxes, other tactics that were used to keep Black people from voting until the Voting Rights Act of 1964. Felicia, remind us, what were some of the voter suppression tactics that were used back then to prevent Blacks from voting, and women, and how those disenfranchised voters?
Yeah, so, you know, there were a number of activities that were designed to disenfranchise, namely Black voters. Those include, you mentioned poll tax, testing. Even today, some of those things are resurfacing as we look across the national landscape in some of the less progressive states. And so there have been historically just a number of efforts. One of the things that's really important is that restrictions can include, requiring documents to prove that your citizenship or identification, or any other obstacles for voter registration drive, limiting, the window of time. There are new tactics that are at play today as well that continue to plague voters. One of the things we saw in Georgia was the voter purges. And a number of voters, legally registered voters, were taken off of the rolls. And so some of those things continue until today.
Katrina, how do we see voter suppression today still? Same question.
Yeah, again, the materials required. So in certain states, the ID that is required to register to vote. Certain people might not have access to a driver's license. In some states, like you have to register to vote by a mail-in ballot. So that disenfranchises younger people who aren't as familiar or comfortable with the mail, and would much more easily be able to apply to vote online. So thankfully in Illinois, we have online voter registration, but things like that, just like the logistics, little logistics like that can create a lot of barriers.
So, after the 2020 election, over a dozen Republican-led legislatures passed voting restrictions, from changing voter ID requirements, limiting when voting can happen, prohibiting even providing bottles of water to people who are waiting in line to vote, among the laws that were passed across the country in different states. Mary, how does this impact voting rights?
Well, these are some of the basic requirements, if you will, in some cases, to keep people engaged. And so they've gone after the critical pieces of bringing people together, not letting people have the opportunity to vote on Sundays. In some cases, that's been a big move, and particularly in the South, particularly for Black folks, that's a concern. And so all of these tactics may seem small, but they really do have a cumulative effect in really discouraging people from going to the polls. And that's the idea, because they know what we know. And this, these are primarily Republican bodies that Black women in particular have come out to vote and have organized, and they will continue to do that. And so anything that they can do to chip away at that is what they're doing. And it's really starting to spread to, of course, a variety of communities. Any communities that is under-resourced and in some cases underrepresented are really going to feel the impacts of these restrictions.
I want to remind our participants, those of you who are joining us, that of course you're welcome to get in on this conversation as well by adding something into our Q&A function. I'm not sure we have a chat, but we do have a Q&A, and that's where you can tell me what you're thinking and what your questions are. Felicia, coming to you, we talked about this. What communities are at the greatest risk of being impacted by some of the restrictions that we've just named? Oopsie. That's two.
So sorry. All right. So I mentioned this a little bit earlier, talking about the trans community. And so, these voter ID laws are, they're strict laws that are part of the ongoing strategy really to suppress the vote. And over 21 million US citizens don't have qualifying government issued photo ID. There was just recently, if you had asked me, does my current ID match my voter registration card because of a name change, I would say it didn't. And so trans women and the trans and non-binary community at large also face barriers to voting due to voter registration forms and voter ID laws that ask for gender and do not permit voters to update their names, gender markers, or even photos. And even in states that do allow trans and non-binary people to correct their IDs, voters often have to jump through a lot of hoops to do so. And the data suggests that transgender citizens are more likely to have less accurate IDs if they're young, people of color, 48%, students, 54%, and those with low incomes, 60%. And then the disability community, many voting places are not accessible. And so it's an additional barrier for those, for persons with disabilities. And in 2018, Latinx and Black Americans were twice as likely as whites to be unable to get off work while polls were open to even be able to vote. And so the accessibility is also an issue.
So, I mean, on that last point, you know, it's a matter of maybe income, right? Maybe you just don't work the kind of job that will allow you to step away or to be late so that you can go and vote. And maybe the state does not have a law saying that, you know, you need to be allowed 2 hours to vote or whatever it might be. One thing that you mentioned, Felicia, that I want to clarify, just to be sure that it's clear for the audience, you know, if people who are trans, especially younger trans folks, why are they less likely to have that accurate, to have an up-to-date ID?
Well, part of it is, you know, a lot of them get their IDs, their first IDs through their registrations at school. And their registrations at school are often tied to, and for someone who has transitioned, dead names, and so it doesn't allow for them to be able to update with their current state, their current the way that they identify today. And so we just have been, the laws and the access has really been lagging as it relates, but that is a form of disenfranchisement. It really, because at the end of the day, it's their legal US citizen should have access to the ballot. And for these technicalities, they are being prohibited access to the ballot.
Brandis, can I add something there and just say that in small communities, particularly smaller communities where someone may be known and they're transitioning, it makes it even harder because the voting location most likely knows the person. They know them, you know, before they've transitioned, and they won't really even give them the access that they need as the person is transitioning and using a different name. So they don't have the legal document. And if you're in a smaller community where everyone knows you, they know that you're transitioning. And so that also adds to it.
Now, all of that said, you know, folks who have supported and, you know, the people who have, you know, propped up these laws across the country, you know, they make the argument that, you know, the ballot is sacred, and shouldn't we ask for some sort of identification to confirm that the person who is casting the ballot is really who they say they are? What do you say to that argument?
I'll jump in. Well, I think about
Felicia first and then Mary.
The framers of the Constitution. So this was before you had IDs. And so when you think about who's signing the Constitution, and there's plenty there, the history is replete with people putting their mark, right? So what is their mark? An X. And so that today, so in that context, there weren't any IDs, there wasn't any driver's license or any kind of government issued ID. And so if you go back to that standpoint, then today it seems a little, to me, it just seems a little foolish to say, oh, well, now we need to put these additional barriers in place.
I absolutely agree. And, you know, there are many ways that we've seen this work even now with regard to, I mean, I had an unexpected incident where I was someplace and I needed to show my vaccination card. And believe it or not, I didn't have my picture ID on me. However, I had about 10 different things in my wallet that did have my name on it. I even said, you could go to my website and see that it's my face. There's many ways that we can verify someone's identity, and the processes that have been put into place clearly are to disenfranchise voters. And so we could do better if we wanted to.
Katrina, Chicago Votes, you know, you all also do some pretty significant work around those, getting people who have been impacted by the carceral system to vote. But first, just so people are clear on this, because I think it makes a difference when it comes to voting rights, the difference between jail and prison.
Yes, thank you for bringing that up. So people use those terms interchangeably and synonymously, but when it comes to voting rights and a lot of other aspects of experiencing incarceration, those are very different institutions. So when you're in jail, for the most part, you are there being held pre-trial. You are innocent until proven guilty in the eyes of the law, and you do retain your right to vote. In Illinois, the difficulty with that has been access to the ballot. You have the right, but if you're incarcerated, how do you retain access? So in 2019, Chicago Votes advocated for Senate Bill 2090, which turned Cook County Jail into the first official polling location in the country. And it also required all other jails throughout Illinois facilitate absentee ballot programs for people in jail. People in prison, on the other hand, have been found guilty. They're serving a conviction, in Illinois, if you're serving a conviction, you do not have the right to vote. However, the second you are done serving your conviction in a carceral institution, you have the right to vote. So in Illinois, if you are on parole or probation, you have the right to vote. And if you are in jail pre-trial, even if you have a previous felony, you have the right to vote.
And it seems to me like for folks who've been in prison, in state prison, who have been convicted and are serving that time, that the problem there might be around awareness, that they don't know that they can still vote once they're out.
Yeah, that has been a huge issue. And I think nationally that's an issue just because voting rights for people impacted by incarceration vary state by state. But in Illinois, also thankfully in 2019, we passed House Bill 2541, which requires the Illinois Department of Corrections to facilitate peer-taught civics classes 6 months prior to release from incarceration. So people are being taught their civic rights and responsibilities. They practice filling out a voter registration form. They practice filling out ballots so that when they leave, they are then prepared to practice the civic duty of voting.
Okay, thank you. And so we do have a question from one of our participants in the chat. The question is, what are some effective ways to encourage minorities to vote in spite of the many oppositions faced? Who wants to jump on that one first? Mary, looks like you.
Sure, I'll go. I think lots of community gatherings and smaller community gatherings and groups going out to talk to people about some of the possible restrictions and the ways that voting is being suppressed is really important, because I think people, word is spreading and people might have some sense of it. However, in some cases, they don't understand it fully until it's too late. And the election has gone by. And so I think working through local small community organizations is really important, and doing public education. And certainly groups like Chicago Foundation for Women does that, and many other community groups where we can ask information about the information, we can ask the questions, and then people can consistently hear it. There's a reason why commercials play, the same commercial plays, multiple times, because people have very short attention span. So I think we have to have a variety of strategies to get the word out to people.
All right, thank you. All right, go ahead, Katrina.
So going off that, I think education is a huge component. I think in general, our civics education is lacking as a country, and the civics education we do receive, like for me, it was largely focused on presidential elections. Like that's the focus. And a lot of people, when they think of voting, they solely think about that. And then when you think about the impact it's having on your day-to-day, we might not see the impact of President Joe Biden on our day-to-day, but we do see the impact of Mayor Lori Lightfoot. We do see the impact of other elected officials more closer to us, of judges, of the state's attorney. So what's been really successful for us, specifically in motivating young people to vote, is tying specific positions and the power they have to the issues young people care about. Issues really care about criminal justice reform. Young people really care about reproductive justice and access to that, economic justice. So these are things that when we know what young people care about, we can be like, hey, did you know that this elected official has power over this? And this is how we can impact them. So that's been very successful for us.
Brandis, the thing that I would add is, I just think about my grandma telling me, if your vote wasn't important, they wouldn't be trying to take it from you. And then I also think about the people who died so that I could have this right. And so that's the soapbox I usually start with, that people died so that I could have access to the ballot. And that if I then don't do my part, right, then I have failed them, right? I'm not being a good ancestor to future generations. And that voting is also about power. So let's, being clear, and Katrina talked about understanding the different levels and how a judge can impact you, in what ways that they can impact you, how each of the levels of government have a different impact on your life and possibly your well-being, your ability to determine what schools you go to, perhaps what happens if you get stopped for a traffic ticket, and particularly in communities of color. And so I look at the outsized effect that a stop, for example, or a traffic ticket can have on a person's life and well-being. And to me, that signifies the importance of then having a say in who the judge is that's making those decisions, but at every level. And so one of my best memories is in the barbershop. Well, my sister worked in a beauty shop that was half barbershop. And, you know, those are always really good for having conversation going. And we had a robust discussion about voting. And some of the young Black men were saying that they weren't going to vote. And I started talking about the stats around how likely they were to get stopped, how likely, like how all of these things impacted them. And that really it was in their best interest. Like I'm probably less likely, not that I'm not unlikely, but less likely to be before a judge and the likelihood that they would be. So trying to get them to understand that they have a vested interest in seeing who gets elected in the process.
Can I just also add, picking up a little bit on what Katrina was saying about education, many nonprofits think they cannot talk about voting. They think that that is comparable to taking a position on an election, and that is not the case. And so public education is absolutely allowable as a nonprofit, and I would just encourage organizations to do this work as well. It can happen in community groups, it can happen at, through foundations, but it can happen in nonprofits, and they can, again, really help with the public education on all these different pieces that may impact their particular constituency.
All right, that was a good question from our viewer. Thank you, Pastor Foster, because all of our panelists had some very good answers to that one, so thank you. I wanna include, here's a comment from someone, we're talking about IDs and these new requirements, or not what's old, now new requirements. From Mary Hahn, I've been an election judge for many years and a person's signature is difficult to fake. IDs are easy to fake. I would rather the voter asking for a ballot be able to match a signature on file than show me an ID. And then another question from an attendee is, what is a good resource for becoming aware of what position goes with what power of decision? That's a good question. So I think the question is kind of about learning about the various elected positions that are in the state and their importance. State, city, county. Does anyone have any answers on that?
I think
oh, go ahead.
Go ahead. No, you should go.
Go ahead, Katrina.
I was just gonna say, I think specifically around election time, that's when the resources tend to pop up. I know there's a number of voter guides. Chicago Votes creates a nonpartisan voter guide that breaks down candidates, but also just positions in general and what their power is. So looking out for voter guides from trusted resources. I know Injustice Watch is also a great nonprofit journalism group that publishes information about judges and other elected officials specific to mainly the criminal justice system. So that's a good resource. And then Chicago Votes, we actually do have a curriculum on civics education and the different places. So that is also things. So different nonprofits, I would say a lot of nonprofits have that focus on voting, have access to that, but definitely check out like Injustice Watch and then look out for voter guides around election time.
I'll go ahead and say WTTW puts out a voter guide every election year as well. And the one from Injustice Watch that you mentioned, Katrina, was also, I think that one was pretty popular, very comprehensive overview of all the judges and their backgrounds and who was running for what. So, Mary, did you want to add anything? Go ahead, Felicia.
The bar associations, right? So the Chicago Bar Association, the American Bar Association, they usually give you a really good understanding about the qualifications of someone who may, be nominated for judge and maybe even to the Supreme Court. And so having that information readily available. I also know that Chicago United for Equity, they have a really good rundown of judges, of races, of positions. And also, thinking about the organizations that you already are affiliated with, who have the similar values as you. That organization is all about equity. So they're obviously going to let you know about candidates who really do also then stand for racial, gender equity, and some of those other really important equity avenues as well.
And League of Women Voters, someone just put that in the chat as well. It's the one that all of us forgot. Thank you for reminding us. Okay, so Mary, Illinois voting rights legislation, it hasn't changed very much. We're in a mostly Democratic state. But with that said, where would you say voting rights stand in the state of Illinois? Do you have any concerns?
Well, I think we've mentioned some of the concerns, and I think that for, again, communities that are underrepresented already and under-resourced, and that certainly includes folks with disabilities, It includes LGBTQ community. There's a stereotype that exists about folks in the LGBTQ community that they are well-to-do and don't have any concerns about economies, and that's not the case. And so we find, as we said earlier, that many people in the LGBTQ community are working in roles where they don't have access to leave work early or to come in late. They're working in positions where they are not making a lot of money. And so again, they need access and the information, which they're not going to necessarily get at their place of employment. They're going to have to seek out and be educated about the other kinds of opportunities that exist to learn about these important issues. And so I think those are the communities that I'm most concerned about, folks with disabilities, also elderly folks who need assistance in getting to the polls. I mean, that's something that I actually encourage my team at Morton Group to take the day off and to volunteer in their communities as they can, to work at the polls, to get people in cars, do what we can so that people will feel the support they need to get to the and actually vote. I think that's one of the things that we can do in a small way that really will have a huge impact. And those communities are the ones I'm most concerned about.
Katrina, do you think that any of the changes in other states have an impact on Illinois voters?
I think they spark fear, but Illinois, we are a supermajority Democrat state. We have a governor who's very much protective of voting rights. So I'm very thankful to live in Illinois, but I do think there are strides Illinois can then take. Illinois has been a leader and a model for the rest of the country in terms of, we have grace period voting, early voting, online voter registration. You can vote by mail whenever you need to. We have ballot drop boxes. So we are a pretty good model in terms of that. We also were the first state to make a jail a polling location. But I do know that there are strides to lower the age to register to vote to 16. So that would make it easier for young people to become voters. We're also advocating at Chicago Votes for a bill that would restore voting rights to people currently incarcerated. So that is the last remaining chunk of citizens that are ineligible to vote. But then after that, I know there have been strides in states like New York to allow people who are undocumented to have a say in local elections and things like that. So there are some exciting things that Illinois can still look forward to. We're not like this perfect utopia that's reached the perfect voting rights, but we are very lucky compared to other states in the US.
And Katrina, you mentioned legislation that you all are working on to allow people who are in prison to vote. What's going on there?
Yeah, so this bill is being sponsored by Representative LaShawn Ford in the House and Senator Mike Simmons in the Senate. And this bill would restore voting rights to 30,000 people who are currently incarcerated in Illinois prisons. Illinois would be the first state to restore voting rights to people in prison. However, it wouldn't be the only state to allow people in prison to vote. And that is because Maine and Vermont never disenfranchised people in prison to begin with. And then Washington, D.C. has recently allowed people in federal prison to vote, and then Puerto Rico allows people in prison to vote. So this would have a huge impact on particularly low-income communities and the Black community. 55% of people in Illinois prisons are Black, even though Illinois' total Black population is about 15%. So we have an overrepresentation of Black people, we have an overrepresentation of poor people, and we have an overrepresentation of young people in our prisons. And 60% of people in Illinois prisons are from Cook County. So we're draining voices from our communities most impacted by mass incarceration. So that's why this bill is really important.
Okay. A question from one of our participants. Can legal US residents who are not citizens vote?
No, you need to be a US citizen.
Okay, just wanted to clear that up. Felicia, looking ahead, to the primary election that we've got here in Illinois, should be fun. And of course, there are some elections across the country, then the midterms. What are you going to be looking for?
Well, I mean, I think a couple of things should happen. One, we have all witnessed a lot of things that have happened nationally. Katrina, you asked Katrina the question about how are those things impacting people in Illinois? And what I would say is that we should be aware. and we should be aware and we should pay attention to what has happened. And perhaps that should encourage us really to embrace our responsibility. I will say it is a responsibility to participate in the civic process of voting. And so what I would be looking for is for people to understand the issues. If there's something that is important to you, as I alluded to earlier, if there's an organization that is important to you, then you know that they will be talking about candidates that are pro or against, right? They'll help you understand which candidates are for that issue or against that issue. So if you really believe in access to reproductive rights and reproductive choice, if you believe, the ACLU puts out a lot of information. The Cabrini Green Legal Aid here in Chicago does a lot around helping formerly incarcerated people understand where they stand as it relates to their rights today and many others. And so I would say, turn out. Like, it's really, really incredibly important that people exercise this right. Gerrymandering, is real. And so there is, on the ballot, there will be choices about the lines for districts and who represents you. And so I think we all should pay attention because those things have shifted because of census data and so forth. And so the process of changing those boundaries varies from the state level to city council, but it's happening for all of us. And so I think because so much is in flux, it's incumbent upon us to really seek out some data and some of those guides that we all have referenced so far here today.
And Felicia, you just mentioned something that someone in the chat has asked about. Why does Illinois still have gerrymandered voting districts? I think I know the answer to that. You want to jump on that one?
Politics. I mean, the extreme partisan gerrymandering is unconstitutional, but really state legislative bodies, have to find a way that redistricts through independent redistrict commissions and so forth. Or in some places, that's the way they do it. And in some places, they do it themselves. And so it's just politics. It's political power. And so this whole conversation is around why it's important to vote. And I just go back to that. If it was not important, people would not be trying to take that vote, the access to the ballot away from you. And so politics is the reason why we have it in Illinois.
And I think a number of states would probably say the same thing. So I'm going to close out by asking all of you the same question. And Mary, I'm going to come to you first for it, but kind of returning to how we started with the role of Black women and the role that they've had to play in their communities as a voting bloc. And since we're talking about suffrage and voting rights, here's sort of a personal one. Does this integral role that Black women play ever feel like a burden for Black women? And I say this in light of some things that have happened lately, but also, I in my mind, I'm thinking about the Ketanji Brown Jackson confirmation hearings that we just had last week, right? When you talk about like the number of times we have to count the first Black woman, and how she had to maintain so much grace and composure under pressure. Mary, you're nodding your head. Go.
I've just been in that role. I mean, it's very hard being the first and being the only, and I've been in that role. And I think for me personally, it is really important as we think about the election, what's coming down the road is I will be looking for candidates and platforms that really address intersecting identities. I think that's going to be really vitally important. I started my activism in the women's community around reproductive justice. Actually, we were saying reproductive rights then. And so that's really important to me, as well as what's going to be happening for LGBTQ folks. And how comfortable are we with race? Until we deal with racial equity, there will be no gender equity. There will be no LGBTQ equity or any other type of equity. And so those are the pieces that are really important. And it does feel like a lot. I mean, I think one of the things that I talk a lot about when I'm coaching other folks is around self-care. How are you taking care of yourself? Because there is so much that is expected of us as Black women, and particularly if you're part of other communities as well, the expectations are really off the chart, and we try to meet them. I mean, we try to meet them at every step of the way, and so we can't do it all by ourselves. And I think it's important that we do really come together, as we've talked about in a variety of ways, during this session, to find support. to find people that think similarly, as you do, and then to also become active. We can only talk about it so much. We actually have to do something. And I often feel so much better when I've done something. And so I just keep doing something. I think that's really important, to do something.
Katrina?
Yeah, everything Mary has said, I agree with. I think in like movement spaces and voting rights spaces and nonprofit spaces, it's predominantly women. I know most of our volunteer base is women. We have difficulty finding male volunteers who will go register voters inside Cook County Jail. For obvious reasons, people don't want to enter a jail, but I think women always show up, and that's definitely true of Black women. And it's often not a choice, but an expectation. And I think we just need to acknowledge that that's the case and give Black women grace, and maybe like deconstruct why we have so many expectations of Black women and why we're okay with relying on Black women to like swing a whole vote. So that's a huge thing. But I think in general, we've seen it like time and time again, like Black women have led from like abolition, from slave abolition to voting rights. Like Black women have shown up. So I don't think it's ever going to stop, nor do I want it to. I just would like women to get the recognition and to be allowed time of rest and to find fulfillment outside of working all the time and being the people taking care of everybody.
Felicia, last word.
I will say, I'm looking at the quote behind Mary about "we are the ones we have been waiting for." And I think about Black women. The reason why this has been so, visceral for Black women is that we have been really fighting for our own liberation as part of, one of the most marginalized intersectional identities. We have been fighting for our own liberation, and along the way, we have been fighting for others. So whether that has been the suffrage movement, civil rights, reproductive justice, or reproductive rights, then justice, now birth justice, like every one of those efforts has been about being the most marginalized and trying to create space, like expand the amount of space that we have to operate, expand our own freedom and our access to things that make our lives productive. I think about a quote Gwendolyn Brooks said, when she said, "We are each other's harvest, we are each other's business, we are each other's magnitude and bond." And I think that was the type of the feeling when I was raised, when my mother said, "We have a responsibility to and for each other," right? I grew up without a lot, but having that responsibility that so goes Black women, right? So goes the state of Black women will tell you everything that you need to know about the state of our communities and about the state of our country, quite frankly.
All right. Thank you, team. That was another great conversation. Thank you for joining us. That's where we're going to have to leave it for the evening. We're going to share a short form in the chat. I think that'll be coming in shortly. So for our participants, if you click that, then you can submit some ideas, stories, topics, issues that you think we need to be covering. So please do take a minute and fill that out and share your thoughts. Before we part ways, I hope that you all enjoyed today's conversation and that you will watch Chicago Tonight Latino Voices and Chicago Tonight Black Voices. These stream on Saturdays at 6 and Sundays at 10 on WTTW. They are also, there's that form in the chat right there. They also stream live and on demand on WTTW.com/news, as well as Facebook and YouTube. Also, please join us on Monday, April 25th at 8 p.m. for our Chicago Tonight Latino Voices community conversation. And last thing, before I let you all go, please join Paris Schutz, my co-anchor of WTTW Chicago Tonight, on Thursday, March 31st, so that's this Thursday at 6 p.m. for a virtual preview of and a discussion about Ken Burns' new documentary, Benjamin Franklin. Panelists will include the film's producer, David Schmidt, Rabia Mayes, PhD, Vice President of Education at the Museum of Science and Industry, and Jason Coleman, co-founder and executive director of Project Sincere. You can visit WTTW.com/events to RSVP. To my panelists, thank you again for sharing your Monday evening and all of your brilliant insights with us. We appreciate it. And to our viewers, of course, you can go to WTTW.com/events for all of that stuff, as I mentioned. And have a good night, everybody. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night.